My name is Angela and I'm a Malazan reader. I have a problem. Help! Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today a little bit a different video as the second episode in Excavating Malazan. So not so much about the text today, but a little bit more about my own experience with Malazan. So things like what have I actually read from the Malazan world, and also questions like, do we actually have to understand everything to enjoy it? And also, can some of the more complex and disorientating elements that we find in Malazan actually work in favor of the reader? Now, this video came about because I recently saw another booktuber talk about his experience with the first two books, and I will not tell you who this was, because it's not about somebody saying, oh, I didn't like it, or I thought this is a disaster. But it's more about kind like the ideas that came from watching this, and also from reading some of the comments in the comment section. And one of the things that kind like came up again and again is that it seems that our expectations and what we think what Malazan is and what experience we will have when we read Malazan will actually, in some respects, guide us, might make us to DNF the series or to DNF a book in the series, or maybe not even picking up Malazan at all. Around the same time, AP Canavan from A Critical Dragon also had a video up where he was talking about reading against the grain. So what happens when we kind like go against what the text is telling us to do? So another thing that comes up with Malazan quite often, where people tell you, well, just go with the flow. But what happens if we do not follow that advice? If we kind like ignore narrative elements that tell us something or want to shape our reader experience? And I will link this video below in the description box if you haven't seen it yet. So what have I read so far from the Malazan universe, so to say? So I started quite classically with Gardens of the Moon, and then I've read so far 3 of the Malazan books of the Fallen, which would be, as I said, Gardens of the Moon, Dead House Gates, Memories of Ice, and I'm currently reading House of Chains, and I'm like a bit over halfway through that. On top of that, I've read other things by Steven Erikson. I've also read the 2 Baukelin and Corbel Broach novella collections. And yes, I've read them totally out of order. I know the purists will already scream at this stage, but I wanted to read them because, again, AP and Philip Chase were discussing those, and I wanted to kind of like be able to at least follow those videos in some respects. So I thought, okay, I go and read them. And I will tell you a little bit later on how that kind of like went. Did I actually understand what I was reading? So I've read those 2. And I've also read, again, totally out of order, The God Is Not Willing, which is set kind of like, I think, 10 years after the 10 big books. So the Malazan Book of the Fallen has finished. And the last book I've read by Steven Erikson is not set in the Malazan world. That's his novel Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, which is like a first contact novel. And I've read 1 novel so far by Ian C. Esselmont, and that is Night of Knives. Now, as I already said, I haven't necessarily read them in this order, and the reading journey wasn't either so straightforward that it didn't matter or that I didn't have any problems or anything like that. And that gets me kind of like to, well, maybe our first preconception of how to read Malazan or what to expect when we're reading Malazan. And this is that Malazan is such a big series, And yeah, where do I start? Which order do I read this in? Now, there are, of course, several answers to this. So the classic answer that you probably will hear is start with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the 10 big books, and start with those and read those. So starting with Gardens of the Moon, which is what I did as well. But I also know that a lot of people say, 10 big books, and well, they get bigger towards the end. No, I don't want this, or will I have the time for this, or that's so intimidating. And I think that there are alternatives. Overall, actually, I think that the way Malazan is structured is actually quite reader friendly, because we don't have to read the, I don't know, 30 plus books all in one go. No, we can break it up. We can start at different points. It makes a lot of sense to start with Gardens of the Moon, but if this is really not your thing, you could easily start as well with The God Is Not Willing. It's starting a new trilogy, and I haven't completed the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but I also didn't have any problems in understanding what's happening in The God Is Not Willing, because the book gives you really everything that you need to understand it. The only thing one will, of course, not understand is all the links that it might have to Malazan Book of the Fallen. But so be it. And you could also start with Ian C. Esselmon's Knight of Knives, because that would equally work. Again, it's a book that in this case is actually set almost before Gardens of the Moon. I think it's between the prologue and then the rest of the book, but you could kind of like read it before Gardens of the Moon without any problems. Again, it's a book that gives all the information that the reader needs to understand the book itself, so there shouldn't be any problems there either. And the other thing I think is, well, like in every other series, we of course just read one book at a time. If you manage to read them back to back, brilliant. I know there are people who can do this. I'm not one of them. I can't do this. I had long periods between those books, and there's nothing wrong with this, and it works quite well, because each book is coming to a sort of conclusion. So there is no major cliffhanger or anything, but the book ends and comes to something that can be called a satisfying ending. And I think the only exception are the last two books, which are more or less one book, two books rolled into one, where the advice is to read those two back to back. But with all the others, that's not necessarily the case. And yeah, it's really up to the reader and what type of reader you are and how you want to tackle that. My second preconception that I hear a lot is I have to have read a lot of fantasy, or I have to have read certain series before I can even start Malazan. And I would say no. Now, I would also acknowledge I'm not a typical reader. If you have a PhD in a literary field like I have in comparative literature, you're not the average reader anymore. But even so, I've read a lot. I have by far not understood everything that's going on in the books that I've read so far. And I think that's perfectly okay. When it comes to, how much do you need to have read? Well, anything you have read, of course, is good. But also, even if you haven't read any fantasy books ever so far, you might actually even have an advantage, because Erikson might not necessarily write the typical fantasy. So that might actually be an advantage in some respects. Another thing one hears a lot is every book does something different. With each book we have no characters, not just a new setting, no a new continent is starting. It doesn't make any sense to get attached to characters, because who knows, they might not make it through the book and they might not return to the book. So what is one supposed to do with all of that? And I would say I actually think that this is a big plus and not necessarily a negative. And that brings me a little bit to talk about my experience with Dead House Gates. So I started reading Gardens of the Moon and was actually over the moon, because I thought, wow, this is my type of fantasy. I want more. Great. And I went straight into Dead House Gates, and yeah, things weren't so great anymore. It wasn't totally wonderful. It got for me harder and harder to read this book. I found especially one element very triggering, and no, it's not the usual ones like the Felicen story or the Coltane story arc or any of those. No, none of those. But yeah, it got so bad that I stopped reading Dead House Gates completely. Maybe something like 100 pages before I would have finished the book. So I had 100 pages left. And I said, okay, I had enough of this. I will not continue with this book. So I stopped. And I stopped for quite a long time. At least 2, maybe even 3 months. And started reading other stuff in between. So things I've read in between. Actually, the first thing I picked up when I decided, okay, this is probably the end with me and Malazan, was then a graphic novel. So I didn't even pick up a normal book as such after that experience. The next thing that I then read by Erikson was actually his, as I say, first contact novel, Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart. And you might well ask, yeah, well, if Dead House Gate was so awful, why did we even bother to read anything else? And I think my reason is that overall I like the idea behind Malazan. I like how Erikson conceptualizes his ideas as well. So when I see him in interviews, I think, yeah, okay, I can understand this, or some of it I find actually also close to my own creative process. And I think, yeah, I would like to find out more about this, experience more about this. So on one level, I was actually quite sad when I decided not to read on and thought, okay, the guy has written other stuff. Let's give something else by this author a try. And this is how I came about to read Rejoice. And I was very positively surprised, I have to say. And thought, wow, this is actually wonderful. I mean, I knew when I was reading Dead House Gates, it's not a bad book, and that Erikson is actually a good writer. It just didn't really click for me or register with me anymore, because all the, how shall I say, violence and negative aspects of the book were taking over so much that it didn't register with me anymore, that there might be something good in that book. Now, what has this to do with we get a new set of characters with every book, or we get a new setting with every book? And the answer is, when I finally decided to continue Dead House Gates and finish it, and then eventually move on to Memories of Ice, I was actually quite glad that we weren't going back to the setting of Dead House Gates, or that there wasn't more of the same, because if this would have been the case, I probably wouldn't read Malazan anymore. I would have packed it in and said, no, thank you. I had enough of this. I don't want this anymore. So from that point of view, I actually think that the books do different things, that the books introduce us to, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say different themes, but different aspects of themes, that the books introduce us to new characters might actually be a positive thing, because in my case, it definitely helped me to read on. Also, I would say when it comes to characters, well, the more characters are, the better actually, because we get more potentially interesting figures that we might be able to identify with. If there is just one POV character or one main character and we don't like that character, that's most likely the end. No, we might say, well, nah, I don't like this book, I don't want to read on. Whereas if there are new characters over and over again, we might actually find new characters that we like. So I would actually see that as well as a positive, and not necessarily as something negative. yeah, when it comes to, yeah, why would I get attached to a character? Why not? As long as you have a good time with that character, and as long as the character is there in the book, and you like that character, I don't think that that should be a reason then not to identify or not to root for a character, just because that character might at some stage not be in the book anymore and in the series anymore. Another thing that's mentioned quite a bit is Malazan is very violent. And I have to say, yes, Malazan is very violent. There is not much one can do about it or say against this. I would definitely say if you have any problems or any previous trauma, take the trigger warning seriously. I myself, I haven't really made up my mind yet. I don't really know in some respects either how to relate to this violence. It's probably one of the biggest problems I have with Malazan. And yeah, it's still wait and see. And I think, well, maybe I might make even a whole video on, yeah, why I think that the Malazan violence hits me so differently than in other series, because it's not as if I haven't read any other violent books, or as if I wouldn't watch any, I don't know, news that are full of violence, or TV series or anything like that, or films. So yeah, there is a big question. Why is the violence in Malazan so much more impactful for me than in other books? But as I say, I don't have an answer yet. And we'll see. If I find one, I'll let you know. But one also has to say, Malazan is not just violence. Malazan is so much more. There's a lot of humor in there, especially the soldiers, the sappers, and their humor. There are great characters, really wonderful characters. Also, there is a great plot in some respects. I mean, the plot unfolds very, very slowly from one book to the next. But I personally find that as well enjoyable because, yeah, as I say, with each book, you have this feeling you get another piece of the puzzle, or if you're lucky, you might even get a handful of pieces of the puzzle. So again, I wouldn't think that just because it might be violent in parts, that this is necessarily something that speaks against the series or against the books. Especially the violence is not there just for violence sake. In a lot of cases, it's more explored, yeah, the aftermath of violence. And also, yeah, it's, I mean, we're talking thousands of pages, and about most of those pages are not about violence. A lot of these pages are, yeah, us following people who try to survive in a war zone, who trudge through very vast, endless landscapes. And we follow them and their, yeah, how shall I say, anxieties, desires, hopes. So yeah, I think the book is much more than just violence as such. The next one is Malazan is complex and disorientating. And again, yeah, on one level, this is actually true. Some actually say, well, when I've read Gardens of the Moon, I felt as if somebody threw me under a bus and I hadn't a clue anymore what was going on. But I think it's important also to realize that this is not solely due to the reader. We all, I think, experience some of this disorientation while reading Malazan. And the reason for that is that some of it is actually deliberately done by the author. The author does employ some techniques that will add to the sense of what exactly just happened, what is going on. One of them, for example, would be that a lot of key scenes we are not told through a main POV character that's part of that scene, but there is a third-party observer who looks on, some onlooker who gives us a commentary about the scene. And this can add again to this feeling of what's really going on? Have I just gotten all the information or not? And yes, in some instances, the characters we're following don't have all the information either. So the information is limited by what we're told and what the characters themselves are told as well. And I think the reason for this is that Malazan mimics something that we do find in life as well. Malazan, mimics those feelings that we might have ourselves, that we go through life, and when we say, well, why would I follow characters or root for characters in Malazan? Well, we root for characters in our own life as well. It's what makes us human. It's one of our big human traits that we need, that we need some type of community around us. That we fall in love, that we get children. And we do this in the full knowledge that we might lose those people in our lives. And they don't even have to die. They might just move away to a different city or leave our lives in other forms. But still, we make friends, we fall in love, we have families. And I think it's the same with Malazan, just on a different scale, that this is mimicked with the characters and how do we relate to those characters. And the same goes to how much do I understand actually what's going on. Well, if we look at our life, do we understand everything that's happening in our lives? No, we don't. And we just make do because it's normal. It's how life is. And again, I think Malazan actually mimics life in that respect, that we never have all the information and we will have to make do in some respects. So if there's something that I would say that I've taken away so far from my own Malazan journey, from reading First Gardens of the Moon, then my really not good experience with Dead House Gates. Dead House Gates has made it on my super short list. There are only 3 books on that list of books I will not reread. And Dead House Gates is number 2 on this list at the moment. I don't know if it will stay there or if that will change again. We'll have to see while I kind of like finish up the series, but at the moment that's where Dead House Gates is. That said, I absolutely loved Memories of Ice. And the book that actually made me then return to Malazan Book of the Fallen was actually The God Is Not Willing. So a book I read completely out of order, and I thought, wow, what a book. This is wonderful. No? This guy can write, this book speaks to me, this book is ticking all the boxes. So if I've learned something from that, then it's that Malazan is constantly changing. It's changing from book to book, and as I said, I personally see that as a positive. It's also changing from reader to reader. No reader will have the same Malazan experience because we all bring different backgrounds and different life experience towards those books. But it will also change from me, from maybe even day to day, because I change, my motivation might change. So and that there is actually a lot in the advice that people say, well, read at least the first 3 books, because I think that's the minimum that one needs to understand how this series changes, how the books change, and how one as a reader then has to readjust how one wants to relate to those books. And the second thing also to keep in mind is there is no one meaning of Malazan. It's not like a treasure hunt where we go and hunt for meaning. If you understand more, wonderful. If not, it's equally valid, and it's an equally valid process, because on one level, an experience that I didn't have, I cannot miss. For example, when I said I read The God is Not Willing completely out of order, a lot of people were saying, well, can you even understand this when you don't get the connections to House of Chains, and it's linked into this, and does this even make sense? And yes, it does make sense, because at that point I didn't have read House of Chains, and it didn't make any difference to me. Not having had this experience, I didn't miss anything either. So I think we need to kind of like normalize this a little bit more, that we acknowledge there is not this one meaning, and also there shouldn't be this kind of like hunt for meaning, but that we might want to focus more on our personal enjoyment and maybe enrichment that we might get out of those books. And also, understanding is an endless process. The way I understand the books at the moment will probably change as soon as I finish the next book. I got, for example, some comments from seasoned Malazan readers on my first Excavating Malazan video saying, oh, do you just wait when you've read the end of the series, your viewpoint on what you kind of like presented here will change. And yeah, that might well be the case, but again, I have no problem with that. I think that's quite normal, that the more we progress in a series, that we might change our mind about characters, about themes, about the plot, and about a lot of other things. Actually, I think that this constant and endless process of understanding is what actually will lead to something like renewed enjoyment, and will make this renewed enjoyment possible. Because if I reread the series, I will find new things, and I will find new joy in them. Or even if I read on, I will find new things. I will find more understanding, different understanding. So I hope this was at least a little bit making sense to you. And I hope that if you are like me, a Malazan newbie, that you might, get a little bit out of this. The next Excavating Malazan will be more text focused again. And next week actually will be something totally different. It'll be a very kind of like, hopefully nice review video. So until that video, happy reading and all the best.